Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is looking at putting forward legislation to encourage Alberta to transition away from the energy sector. This has infuriated many right here in our province, since oil and gas is a large part of how we generate revenue and beef up equalization payments to support some of the other provinces in need. Now, to talk about this in more detail is political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, who joins us once again from Toronto. Now, Brian, it appears as though the PM has been taking a few shots at Alberta, which has not been sitting well with Premier Daniel Smith in the UCP caucus.
Yeah, he was giving an interview to Reuters at the start of the year, and he went off on Alberta in a very strange way because it's not the way he would talk about any other province. So I understand why Albertans are so frustrated. Look, he's talking about how the political class in Alberta doesn't care about the environment, doesn't want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You talk to the energy sector, I've been doing it for a decade. You've been doing it a long time. You talk to politicians. You listen to Premier Danielle Smith, and I saw her on TV just the other day talking about how she wants Alberta to have the greenest barrels. That was the term she used. We want to have the greenest barrels in the world. And that was before Trudeau had made his comments, or at least before they were public, I believe. And she's talking in this way. And Trudeau is just dismissive because it's someone who is on another side politically from him, who he doesn't have a good relationship with, and decides that he's got to go all in on attack on them. It's not leadership. It's not the way it should happen. Most Canadians would actually like to see our political leaders work together for the most part. Now, look, both in Alberta and in Quebec, taking a shot at Ottawa is a surefire way for a provincial politician to boost themselves. But when it comes down to getting things done, people still want both levels of government to work together, not fight, not get in the way of each other. And that appears to be what Trudeau's doing now. And you talk about this green transition. Well, there's the Canadian Green Growth Fund, and Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland was being grilled over that the other day at a Senate committee over the fact that there's $2 billion in the fall economic statement for this. And it's to buy shares in a corporation that doesn't exist to try and attract private money to pay for this green transition, and it's not even set up. They're putting money into getting Alberta off of oil and gas before they even know what they're doing. It's quite frustrating on all sides.
Brian, let's talk about another hot button issue that impacts so many provinces, and that's healthcare. And now Canada's premiers want more funding to support our healthcare. The Prime Minister so far has said no. Why not?
Well, he said no, despite the fact that in 2015, when he was first elected, he called the funding formula that he's held to this entire time a cut. I don't know if you recall, but he was going around saying there's a $36 billion Harper cut to healthcare. Of course, that Harper cut to healthcare didn't take effect until 2017. The Harper government had said, look, we're increasing funding at about 6% a year, plus population, plus inflation. That's too much. We'll make it 3% plus population and inflation. Trudeau called that a cut, said it was disastrous, and then adopted it. Because, as I said, it didn't take effect until 2017, 2 years after he was in office. He has said that he would work with premiers. He has refused to meet with them as a group on this. When premiers have raised ongoing funding issues on the many calls that he's had with them about COVID-19 and the pandemic, he says now's not the time. But when Trudeau's asked about it, he says, I've had more meetings than anybody else about healthcare. Yeah, but when they raise it on those calls, he says no, not now. Trudeau wants to have his cake and eat it. He wants to be seen as the savior of healthcare. He doesn't want to put forward the money. Now he's trying to put conditions in ways that the premiers won't accept. Are premiers willing to say that, yes, they will be accountable to their people on how that money is spent? Absolutely. But Alberta has the youngest population among the provinces in the country, whereas somewhere like Nova Scotia has one of the older populations. So there's going to be different needs for the healthcare system, and having Ottawa dictate that from bureaucrats out at Tunney's pasture isn't the way to do it.
Now, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith says she may in fact go ahead with her own healthcare reforms. What would they potentially look like, Brian?
Well, all of the premiers are looking at different ways to deliver healthcare. And I can tell you that here in Ontario, Premier Doug Ford has been talking about an expanded role of the private sector. Now, that doesn't mean privatizing who pays for your care. This is not about going to a private insurance model. This is about saying, look, you need cataract surgery. We'll use the eye care private eye care center that's already there that has capacity. You need knee or hip surgery, and it's a simple operation. We will use facilities that exist that are already performing operations outside of the public system and use them inside the public system to clear away backlogs. Scott Moe's been talking about similar things in Saskatchewan. I know that Danielle Smith is saying that she will look at those types of procedures, those types of potential opportunities, but that she will also look at what the province actually needs. If you can't measure, you can't plan. And a lot of things we just don't know in our healthcare system. You know, what is a procedure actually costing us? How long is the actual wait time? We have vague notions of this, but the actual data on healthcare, Alberta is actually better than other provinces from my experience, but it's still not where it should be considering the amount of money that goes into it. So she's looking at a bunch of reforms that will change the way that it works. As far as I can tell, she is not talking about going to away from the single payer system, which for guys our age, Hal, you know, philosophically we cannot be on board with it. But once you crest over 50, trying to buy private health insurance for yourself in an American style system wouldn't work here. That's a non-starter. It's not happening no matter how much the people that want everything unionized, everything paid for by and performed by public sector unions, despite their cries, that's not what's happening here. But they are looking at different ways of delivering. And I can tell you on that front, when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was here in Ontario and Doug Ford said to him in front of the cameras, the current system isn't working, the status quo can't continue, Justin Trudeau agreed with him and didn't push back on Ford's plans.
You know, a big issue for us here in the province as well, as it is in many provinces, is the shortage of doctors. I don't have a doctor. My doctor moved to Holland. I talked to some of my coworkers as well in the newsroom. Their doctors left, went to other provinces, went down to the States. So yeah, the shortage of physicians is a major issue, not just here, but I know across the country. Brian, let's talk about carbon capture for just a moment here. Now, the issue of carbon capture and storage is, as you've said in the past, part of Canada trying to keep up with the United States and their subsidies for this technology, or massive subsidies for electric vehicles. Do you think this is wise to offer huge subsidies to industry?
Probably not, but the Trudeau government seems to be going that way. And this is something that US President Joe Biden included in, oddly, what he calls his inflation control package. He's got all these subsidies going to the energy sector, going to the electric vehicle sector. He wants to subsidize the consumers to purchase electric vehicles. Look, electric vehicles aren't for everyone. They're not for every location. They're not for every use of a motor vehicle. But the industry is moving towards electric for your average daily commuter, the average daily person. Yeah, electric is where the industry is moving, with or without government intervention. But do we need to have it subsidized? Some provinces have been doing that. Others haven't. The federal government has a modest one. But it costs, overall, it costs taxpayers a fair amount of money. Joe Biden and the Democrats in the United States want to offer huge subsidies. Now, the Trudeau government, thanks to the help of some Democrat senators, were able to change the way that it's being offered so that it doesn't punish Canadian-made cars or Mexican-made cars and violate the free trade agreement. But it's still coming in a massive way. And so the Trudeau government thinks that whether it's that or whether it's the massive subsidies for the energy sector to get into carbon capture and storage, that they've got to match them. This is going to cost us in a huge way. And it's funny how governments offer a tax cut and people call it a race to the bottom. And we shouldn't give all these companies tax cuts and match the tax cuts that other jurisdictions are giving. We should keep taxes high. Why? So that we can give those tax dollars directly to companies or directly to consumers, and that's what's going to happen here. I have great concerns about how much this is going to cost the Canadian Treasury because the Trudeau government hasn't exactly laid out what their plans will be or what the bottom line hit will be.
Brian, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is in Mexico City meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden and Mexico's President Obrador. The Three Amigos Summit, as it's being called, I guess they'll be talking about business, including what, softwood lumber?
They'll be talking about what the issues that we just discussed: the carbon capture and storage, the electrical vehicle tax credit. They'll be talking about energy. You know, it's interesting. The United States going around the world looking for energy. They're looking at everything except a pipeline that could come from Canada. They're looking at everything but that. So, you know, will Justin Trudeau be bringing that up? Probably not. But there's a lot of other trade irritants, and softwood lumber is one. The Biden administration doubled the tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber. They are looking at country of origin labeling for agricultural products like beef, which has to be a huge concern in Alberta. Now, that seems to have been put on pause, but the beef ranchers in the United States that want that back in place, whether it's for beef or for hogs, they have the president's ear, and he is open to them. That has to be a concern that the Canadian government is raising while they're at this summit. But again, you know, the trade irritants between Canada and the United States, for anyone that thought that they would go away under Joe Biden, they're actually worse. It's just that you don't hear about it as much because Donald Trump isn't there. It's not just a partisan thing. Trump was his own circus. Trump made sure that you knew what was going on. Biden sticks the knife in you with a smile.
Brian, sadly, we've seen 5 police officers killed in the line of duty in Canada since last September. Now, you wrote about a statement from the biggest police associations in the country last week where they said enough is enough and they want changes. Is our federal government really not doing enough on crime?
They're not. And of course, they just recently passed a bill that reduced mandatory minimum sentences for serious gun crimes. Now, this was put forward by Justice Minister Lametti as helping people who made a just an honest mistake, and we can all understand that, how people making youthful, honest mistakes or stupid, you know, acting stupid when they're young. We've all been there. But the mandatory minimums they got rid of in many cases on the gun crime side. There was no mandatory minimum for your first offense. It was a mandatory minimum for your second and third offense. And we're talking about crimes like extortion with a gun, robbery with a gun smuggling, gun trafficking. So you're selling illegal guns, carrying prohibited weapons, things like that. And they got rid of those mandatory minimums. They also brought in something in 2019, sorry, called Bill C-75, and it reformed the way that bail is handed out. This is now starting to we're really starting to feel the effects of this. Everyone from Toronto's Mayor John Tory to Ontario Premier Doug Ford, Murray Rankin, the British Columbia NDP Solicitor General, saying this is a problem. Police chiefs across the country saying this is a problem because we've got this perp and release system. Somebody commits a crime, they're arrested by the cops, bail is the default option, even if it's a serious crime. We've had a bunch of murders. The OPP officer that was killed while responding to a car in the ditch call, shot and killed. The man now charged with that murder was someone who was out on bail for gun crimes and assaulting a police officer after getting out of jail for an armed robbery with a gun and not following his parole conditions. So, you know, and we can point to stories like this across the country. This is a problem. And the police say they want changes on the bail front. They didn't give specific recommendations, but say they will be coming. 5 police officers killed in 4 months. They said that is unprecedented and it needs to stop, and governments need to listen. The Trudeau government's been very soft on crime. Even if provinces want to get tough, their hands are tied. And in many cases, so are the hands of judges and justices of the peace because of the changes the Trudeau government has brought in. They need to get their act together.
Dr. Jordan Peterson has been making headlines for the past few weeks over his fight with the College of Psychologists of Ontario. Brian is facing a license suspension for refusing to take social media retraining. Now, you've read the documents and you've chatted with Dr. Peterson about this. Is he facing prosecution, or is this maybe more a case of political persecution?
Well, it's a prosecution due to political persecution, actually. That's probably the best way to describe it. Uh, Look, Jordan Peterson was a psychologist who operated both in academic and clinical terms. He had a practice, he saw patients. He practiced for years without any issue until he became a public figure, until he took a political stance that was outside of what was considered acceptable by academia, and by many in the media. And since then, he said he has been inundated with complaints, and they're never from patients. It's never about his patients. It's always someone who disagrees with him politically. So I reviewed the investigators' report. I hesitate to call it investigation. They looked over a bunch of tweets. One of them was retweeting Ben Shapiro, who put out a bunch of facts. They're not dispute, they are facts about COVID-19. This was on December 31st, 2021, saying things like most of the people going into hospital are going in with COVID, not because of it. That a cloth mask doesn't stop transmission. That's true. We know that. That you can still spread COVID when you're vaccinated. Shapiro just tweeted that out. Jordan Peterson retweeted it with approving comments saying, let people get back to their lives. He retweeted Pierre Poilievre. Same thing. Pierre Poilievre was tweeting about Government of Canada COVID restrictions. Peterson offered support in saying these need to end. That has nothing to do with psychology. And you can dispute the efficacy of the restrictions in place. But I'll tell you, within a couple of weeks of Peterson showing support for that on Twitter, governments were backing away from those measures because they weren't needed. Why? Because things had changed. So the fact that he's being prosecuted over that, or saying there is no Nazi culture or white supremacist culture prevalent in Canada, that again doesn't have to do with psychology. So it is very much, when you look at the collection of tweets and the comments he made on Joe Rogan's podcast about climate change, and those are the things, and I laid it out in an article at the Toronto Sun. You can read them all yourself, and I cite from the investigators' report. Those are the things that led to the investigation being launched, nothing else. And none of that has to do with psychology. It's all politics.
It's almost like people can't have opinions anymore. Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.